You never really know who your real neighbors are until something small turns into a big mess. For me, that moment came when I walked outside one morning and saw my fence, my carefully built, weathered, perfectly ordinary fence, lying in pieces. Boards splintered, posts uprooted, a pile of wood scattered across my yard like someone had decided it was their personal art project. And right there, just a few yards away, I saw them, the culprits, smiling innocently, chatting like nothing had happened. My first thought was, are you kidding me? My second thought was, okay, this isn't going to slide. At first, I was mad in that deep, simmering way, the kind that makes you pace the yard, muttering under your breath while drinking coffee and trying not to do something impulsive. I stared at the damage, noticing every crack, every splinter, every piece of wood that now blocked my garden path. My backyard, my property, my sense of order, all violated. And I knew immediately that this wasn't an accident. They had done this on purpose, thinking it was funny, or maybe thinking they had some kind of right to my space. I spent a few moments just pacing. The anger was there, sure, but quickly it gave way to something more useful: planning. I didn't want to just yell. I didn't want to escalate into screaming matches, and I certainly didn't want a messy lawsuit if I could avoid it. What I wanted was a solution that would be permanent, undeniable, and teach a lesson that couldn't be ignored. And that's when I started thinking about concrete and steel. Solid, immovable, permanent. Something that would make the boundaries of my property absolutely clear and impossible to cross again. I pulled out the old survey map, checked property lines, measured the exact extent of the damage. The fence had been my guide, but now it was gone, leaving a blank canvas. I walked the property line carefully, visualizing where posts would go, how thick the concrete would need to be, where steel reinforcements could be added to make the structure not just a fence, but a statement. This is my property, and boundaries matter. While I planned, my kids peeked out the window. "Dad, did they break our fence?" one asked, eyes wide. I smiled, keeping my composure. "They did, but don't worry. We're going to fix it, in a way they'll remember." And I meant it. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about asserting rights and teaching lessons cleverly, without stooping to the level of destruction they had already shown. The next day, I started gathering materials. Bags of concrete, steel posts, metal reinforcements, screws, brackets, everything needed to make a fence that couldn't just be pushed over or ignored. I planned the work meticulously, mapping out each section, calculating depth for posts, considering soil stability, making sure that the final structure would be perfectly legal, code-compliant, and utterly immovable. I wasn't just fixing a fence, I was sending a message. And then came the fun part: observation. I kept an eye on them from my porch, pretending to water plants, checking the layout of the new fence in my mind. Every time they came near, I smiled politely, nodding, all while imagining the look on their faces when they saw what was going up. Because this time, it wasn't just wood, it wasn't just a picket fence. It was concrete, steel, reinforced, permanent. It was a fence that screamed, without words, "Don't ever cross this line again." I also documented everything. Photos of the damaged fence, measurements of property lines, sketches of the new reinforced structure. This wasn't paranoia, it was planning. If anyone tried to challenge it, I wanted a record. And honestly, it felt empowering. For once, I was the one in control. I wasn't reacting impulsively. I was creating a solution that would hold up physically, legally, and psychologically. By the third day, the planning phase was complete. I had my materials, my diagrams, my measurements, and my schedule. I enlisted a friend to help with the heavy lifting, someone who knew concrete work, someone who appreciated the artistry of a fence that could survive anything. And while we worked, I imagined the moment of revelation for the neighbors who had destroyed the original fence. The concrete posts going into the ground, steel bars lining the perimeter, the unmistakable permanence of every segment. We were building more than a fence. We were building clarity, security, and a very memorable lesson. Each section we poured, each steel post we cemented, was deliberate. I checked alignments, levels, stability. Nothing haphazard, nothing careless. I even measured how far each post extended into the ground, how thick the concrete mix needed to be, ensuring the fence would endure for decades. And every time I thought about the destruction of the old fence, every splintered board and crooked post, I felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. Not for revenge in a petty sense, but for justice, permanence, and boundaries being respected. By the end of the week, the structure was taking shape. The concrete cured slowly, solidifying into a barrier that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be pushed over, couldn't be accidentally or intentionally crossed without effort. Steel posts glinted in the sunlight, perfectly aligned, each one a statement of authority and permanence. And I could already imagine their faces when they finally realized. This wasn't just a repaired fence, it was a declaration. A declaration that boundaries matter, that respect is required, and that actions have consequences. I paused occasionally, standing back to observe, coffee in hand, kids running around safely behind the new barrier. Even the cat seemed impressed, circling the sturdy posts, sniffing the fresh concrete. And I thought about how much preparation, observation, and patience went into this. This wasn't about anger, it was about strategy. It was about turning a frustrating, destructive act into an opportunity for a clever, undeniable, and lasting resolution. The following days were all about execution. Planning was one thing. Building a fence that could withstand anything was another. I woke up early, coffee in hand, surveying the yard, the piles of concrete bags and steel posts lined up like soldiers ready for deployment. My friend arrived, toolbox in hand, and we set to work. Every post, every panel, every cement pour was deliberate. This wasn't about speed, it was about precision, permanence, and sending a message that wouldn't be ignored. As we worked, I kept an eye on the neighbors. I wasn't hiding. Karen and the group who tore down my fence were just across the way, going about their usual routines. I could see the curiosity creeping onto their faces as they noticed the steel posts going into the ground, the freshly poured concrete, the careful alignment of every segment. They didn't know it yet, but their casual disregard for boundaries was about to collide with something immovable. Each concrete pour required patience. We had to mix batches, ensure proper curing, and set steel reinforcements precisely. The weight of the steel, the wet concrete, the tension of alignment, all of it demanded focus. And honestly, part of me relished it. Not in a petty, angry way, but in the satisfaction of transforming frustration into something constructive, tangible, and permanent. Every splash of wet cement, every braced steel post, was a silent but firm reminder: boundaries matter. While we worked, I documented everything. Photos of the posts as they went in, the concrete curing, the steel bars aligned perfectly. I even made small notes about the placement relative to their property line. Not paranoia, this was strategy. If anyone questioned the fence later, if any dispute arose, I wanted undeniable proof. And as I snapped pictures, I noticed Karen's eyes following us across the street. She couldn't hide her curiosity, or maybe it was unease. And that tiny crack in her composure gave me a quiet thrill. By midweek, the structure was taking shape. The steel posts glinted in the sun, the concrete curing solidly, and the panels lined up perfectly, forming a barrier that couldn't be pushed over or ignored. I paused occasionally to check alignments, levels, and stability. I wanted this to be perfect, not just functional, but a statement. And in that, I found a strange satisfaction, the kind of thrill that comes from turning someone else's disrespect into a carefully executed, undeniable lesson. Karen and the others started noticing. At first, subtle glances, whispered comments across the street. "Looks like they're really rebuilding it," I heard one of them mutter. I pretended not to notice, sipping my coffee, leaning on the shovel, all the while imagining the moment of realization when they would see just how permanent this fence had become. That moment, I knew, would be the high point of this whole ordeal. The final touches were the most satisfying. Steel reinforcements secured, concrete fully cured, and a small section marked with a clear, permanent cap at the property line. I stepped back, surveying the entire fence. It wasn't just functional, it was art, precision engineering, and a clear boundary marker all at once. And as I looked at it, I felt a quiet, simmering triumph. Not a petty revenge, not malicious, but utterly satisfying. The message was clear: respect boundaries, or face consequences that cannot be ignored. Of course, Karen didn't take it well. The first time she came close enough to see the finished fence, I noticed her pause. She stepped back, frowning, tapping her phone, muttering under her breath. I waved casually from my porch. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She looked up, eyes wide. realizing that the boundary she once ignored was now solid, permanent, and utterly unmovable. It wasn't anger, it was awe, confusion, and finally acknowledgement that she had been in the wrong. I made sure every interaction reinforced the lesson without confrontation. When she came closer to inspect, I greeted her politely, answering her questions about the height and materials. "It's all code compliant," I said, "just making sure everything's safe and secure." Her jaw tightened. She understood. This wasn't going anywhere, and she couldn't just push it aside like the old fence. This was permanent. Neighbors started noticing too. Some whispered as they passed by, some stopped to comment on how solid and well-built the new structure was. "Wow, that's impressive," one of them said. I smiled, nodding politely, all the while thinking about the irony. They had laughed when the original fence was torn down, maybe thinking they could get away with disrespect. Now, they were witnessing the consequences of arrogance, executed with precision and patience. By the end of the week, the fence was complete. Concrete and steel, perfectly aligned, impossible to cross, impossible to ignore. The garden was safe, the backyard was secure, and my family could finally enjoy the space without worry. And I realized something important. The satisfaction didn't come from anger, it didn't come from confrontation. It came from strategy, preparation, and executing a plan that was safe, legal, and permanent. Karen learned her lesson quickly. She stopped making snide remarks about my property, avoided the area near the new fence, and even nodded politely once when we passed each other on the street. The subtle shift in her behavior was exactly what I had hoped for. Boundaries had been enforced, and respect was quietly restored without a single yelling match or escalation to the authorities. Reflecting on the whole process, I realized that the best way to deal with someone who crosses lines isn't always anger. It's patience, planning, and execution. By using strategy instead of confrontation, I had transformed a frustrating situation into a victory that was permanent, effective, and utterly satisfying. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one, a reminder that actions have consequences and disrespect is not tolerated. And finally, the lesson extended beyond just property. It was about patience, creativity, and careful observation, about how to handle conflict without escalation, about how to turn frustration into something constructive and undeniable. And as I stood on my porch, surveying the final result, sipping my coffee, watching the sunlight hit the steel posts and glint off the concrete, I knew this story would stay with me, and with them, for a long time. By the weekend, the fence was fully complete. Concrete cured, steel posts standing straight and unyielding, panels locked securely in place. I stepped back to survey the work, coffee in hand, and finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. It wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about sending a message that couldn't be ignored, a boundary that was permanent, undeniable, and utterly respected. The work was meticulous, solid, and if I do say so myself, impressive. A structure that said more with its presence than words ever could. Karen and her crew. Well, she didn't have a crew, really, just her little group of friends, finally noticed. I watched as she approached cautiously, eyes narrowing, glancing first at the steel posts, then the concrete, then the alignment, and finally at me. I waved casually. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She blinked, muttered something under her breath, and stepped back. That pause, the realization that she could no longer encroach upon my property, was the culmination of the entire ordeal. No yelling, no threats, no escalation beyond careful planning, just undeniable permanence. My kids were thrilled. "Dad, it looks amazing," my youngest exclaimed, running around the backyard, pointing to the glinting steel posts. I smiled, letting them enjoy the space that had been violated just a few weeks ago. But more importantly, I realized that the lesson extended beyond physical boundaries. It was about patience, planning, and executing a solution that was clever, legal, and permanent. Sometimes, that kind of strategic thinking carries more weight than immediate confrontation ever could. Neighbors began noticing the new fence as well. Some stopped to comment, admiring the craftsmanship and sturdiness. Mrs. Patel waved from across the street, smiling knowingly. "Looks like they finally learned," she said quietly. I nodded, savoring the subtle acknowledgement. It wasn't about gloating, it was about clarity. Boundaries were respected, rules were enforced, and everyone knew it. without anyone raising their voice. Karen's reaction evolved over the next few days. At first, there was confusion, then frustration, and finally cautious respect. She stopped making snide comments, avoided testing the boundary, and even gave a hesitant nod when she passed by. That subtle change in behavior was exactly what I wanted. I hadn't just rebuilt a fence. I had restored order, security, and awareness of respect in a way that couldn't be ignored. I reflected on the entire process while standing on my porch one evening, watching sunlight bounce off the steel posts. The satisfaction wasn't in anger, it wasn't in revenge, it was in strategy, patience, and precision. I had taken something destructive, frustrating, and disrespectful and turned it into a permanent, positive outcome. The fence was stronger than ever, my family's backyard was secure, and the lesson was absorbed quietly but unmistakably. There are a few takeaways I hope viewers can appreciate. First, patience is powerful. Rushing into confrontation or yelling rarely produces a permanent solution. Second, preparation and knowledge amplify impact. Understanding property lines, building codes, and materials allowed me to execute a solution that was both legal and effective. And third, subtlety and cleverness can teach lessons far more enduringly than direct confrontation. Karen didn't need humiliation. She needed awareness, boundaries, and permanence. Now comes the part one really want to emphasize for anyone watching. What would you do if a neighbor destroyed your property? Would you argue, call authorities immediately, or take matters into your own hands? And if you acted, would you aim for immediate satisfaction or a solution that is permanent, clever, and undeniable? Comment below and share your experiences. I want to see who agrees, who thinks I went too far, and who has their own clever strategies for handling neighbors who ignore boundaries. The fence itself stands as a symbol. Concrete and steel, unmovable and unyielding. It represents patience, planning, and strategy over impulse and confrontation. It demonstrates that fairness and respect can be enforced without resorting to aggression, and that clever solutions are often more satisfying than simple retaliation. By the end of that week, my backyard was restored completely. The grass, the garden, the swing set, and the sense of security, all intact. And I realized something important. The greatest victories aren't always loud or dramatic. They're quiet, calculated, and lasting. They're the kind that teach lessons subtly, effectively, and ethically, leaving both parties aware of boundaries and both parties a little wiser for it. So here's the challenge to viewers. Think about your own boundaries, your own property, your own space. How would you react if someone crossed the line in a similar way? Could you stay calm, plan carefully, and deliver a permanent lesson without escalating into anger or confrontation? Or would you react impulsively, risk escalation, and lose the opportunity for a clever solution? Share your thoughts, experiences, and strategies in the comments. Let's discuss how patience, strategy, and creativity can resolve conflicts more effectively than confrontation. Because at the end of the day, concrete and steel don't lie. Boundaries, when enforced thoughtfully, send a message that words alone cannot. And sometimes, the quiet, clever, lasting victory is far more satisfying than any shouted argument or instant retaliation. Standing on my porch, watching the sunlight catch the steel posts, I knew this lesson would last a long time, both for my family, my neighbors, and anyone else who might think boundaries are optional.